while Mike and I were chit-chatting, Joe got on the phone with Mark Taylor-Canfield, I assume.
So, Mark, are you with us?
Yes. Hi. How are you?
Hey, all right. Now, those of you who were listening to our show the night after the election might recall we were trying desperately to get Mark on the show with us that night, but we had all kinds of technical difficulties. So this is almost a return to Occupy Radio for you, Mark, and I thank you for giving us a second chance after that fiasco of an attempt the first time round.
Hey, no problem. That's technology sometimes, you know.
That is definitely the case. All right, and so you are a journalist, and the way I got in touch with you is because you were covering the case of Leah Plank, Matt Duran, Katie Oljanik, and Matt Pfeiffer. However, you also cover a good number of other topics, but let's start with grand juries. We may get into some of the other ones that you and I discussed. We just finished talking with Chris Hermes. Are you familiar with the Grand Jury Resistance Project?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, he wasn't quite as up to date on this story as I imagine you are. So I wonder if, for starters, if you could talk about the current grand jury going into what happened in Seattle and who is being affected.
Well, at this point, there have been 4 different activists who've received subpoenas, and the only way that we even have information about this is public statements by the folks who've been subpoenaed and statements on the support websites, including no political repression at WordPress. So that's a major support website. You're not going to find any of this information in the mainstream media because the corporate media just refuses to report on it. But if you go to nopoliticalrepression.wordpress.com, you'll find an update there. So that's about the only way to get information is through the folks that are supporting them. But what we do know is that back in July, there were 2 fairly violent raids, actually, on the homes of activists in Seattle and Portland. And in Portland, it actually involved an FBI special team that was reported as being part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. They used flash grenades and held the folks there in Portland at their home until they searched the premises. And supposedly, I guess it was according to the Oregonian or the Mercury, I can't remember which, there was a report that a warrant had been left behind, which mentioned political material, including anarchist material. But police reportedly confiscated a laptop, computer, thumb drives, cell phone, black clothing, and political literature. So this happened also in Seattle later on in July. Had another residence where 2 activists had been living. And the culmination of all this was that in August, a grand jury was called in Seattle. It's a federal grand jury. It's also a secret grand jury, so all of the documents pertaining to the subpoenas and the warrants have been sealed by the U.S. Attorney's Office, and that's U.S. Attorney Jamie Durkin. So it's impossible to go to the federal grand jury proceedings because they're closed to the public. But what we do know is that Matt Duran refused to cooperate back in August, and he's been in jail ever since at a facility in SeaTac, Washington. And then Catherine Oljanik was also jailed, I believe, in September. Leland Plant was jailed and then released, I think, on October 17th. And Matty Pfeiffer is scheduled to appear before the grand jury on December 14th. And he has made public statements that he is going to refuse to testify. So according to the National Lawyers Guild and Neil Fox, this is a witch hunt, and that is exactly what the grand jury resistors are saying, and that's what the folks that have been subpoenaed are saying. So the latest update that I know of, and I am not up on the latest developments either, but what I know from what's been publicly stated is that December 14th is a reconvening of the grand jury, and as of today, there are 2 people in jail. That's Matthew Duran and Catherine Olshan.
So do these folks have any recourse? Let's say that this grand jury goes along and it peters out and they don't put out any indictments. Now they've punished a bunch of people. Is there any justice going on here? Do these people have recourse, or is they just kind of lose a part of their lives because somebody was doing a witch hunt?
Well, of course, I'm not an attorney, but as I understand it, people can be held during the duration of the grand jury proceedings, which at this point, the term of the grand jury has been repeatedly stated as 18 months. As far as I understand it, the problem here, is that, this is why Al Jazeera actually called this America's Pussy Riot, because just from appearance's sake, what you have is you have federal agents, and then in Seattle, it was a Seattle SWAT team violently raiding people's homes, confiscating property, political material, which, according to the NLG, is protected by the First Amendment. And then at this point, there have been no criminal convictions or charges. In fact, the catch-22 is that once people are called before this grand jury, which, by the way, used to be used in RICO cases against mobsters and things like that. And if it was a mob trial, I think that the mainstream media would be all over it. But because it's anarchists and other activists, I don't think that they're willing to report on it. But in this case, the people that are subpoenaed are brought before the grand jury and then are basically put in jail to coerce them to testify about other people. So they, as far as we know, they are told that they are not able to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights. And I believe that Matthew Pfeiffer actually tried to invoke his First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendment rights. But according to the grand jury, since they are not the target of a criminal investigation themselves, they cannot invoke the Fifth Amendment as a way of avoiding incriminating themselves. See, so it's a catch-22. And as far as I know, there is no recourse. I mean, they've done this in many trials before where they just hold people. I unfortunately wasn't able to hear the earlier part of the show. I'm really, interested in checking out the podcast. But we do know that grand juries have been used before and have been accused of being used for political repression, and that anti-war activists and green activists have been brought into that. I know last year Cindy Sheehan was outraged by the fact that someone she had just visited then later got raided. So we know that this has been going on for a long time, and the strange thing is that Glenn Greenwald was in town for the ACLU awards ceremony 2 weeks ago here in Seattle, and I tried to speak to the ACLU representatives about it. Greenwald didn't really have much information, but the ACLU's position on it is that they're not interested in investigating federal grand juries because, as far as they're concerned, this is what it was put to me anyway by the assistant director, is that because the government is following the law when they do these things. Okay, so we'll have to throw into this in context that in December, because some of these people have been involved with Occupy Wall Street demonstrations, and in December, the two United Nations envoys, the envoy for peaceable assembly and the envoy for freedom of expression, wrote a letter to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton condemning the police crackdowns in the United States on the Occupy Wall Street movement, specifically the eviction forcibly from parks and public spaces around the country. So you want to put it into perspective with that, too, which is another story that's not being covered by the mainstream media. And
we've covered a little bit of that ourselves. I think there was another report out by a bunch of different law schools where they talked about how the repression of Occupy Wall Street was, in fact, illegal.
Actually, former Attorney General Eliot Spitzer, actually, from New York, actually agreed with the UN envoy LaRue when he said that freedom of expression and the First Amendment always supersedes city ordinances when it comes to, citing people for, being in a park after 11 o'clock or something. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
So that is the argument. The UN wrote that letter in December. However, until Dan Frumpkin at Huffington Post actually wrote an article about it, which is the only one that I've been able to find, they just sort of buried that letter, and then he forced them, and quote, unnamed spokesperson from the State Department to admit that they supposedly have forwarded that letter to the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. But there's a problem there in that I think part of the criticism that people might have of these crackdowns is that the Justice Department didn't step in when they were happening. So sending them a letter criticizing their lack of action may not get much of a response at this point, unfortunately. But the UN is saying that it violates not only the U.S. Constitution but also international law.
So, in other words, what I think to tie all this together, what you're saying is the current grand jury persecution, basically, of anarchists and occupiers is just another part of a string of governmental repression of a popular movement, which, incidentally, was not something that happened with the Tea Party when the Tea Party rose up into prominence.
Yeah, a little humor there.
Yeah, dry gallows kind of humor.
Yeah.
So Mark, when we were talking, we were talking about this being a grand jury theme. However, you've got quite a bit of history within the Occupy movement, it seems. And one of the things that you pointed out to me in the email is that you actually are part of a group that preceded the Occupy movement. And now, was that in Washington State where this was going on?
Yes, and before I go into that, I just wanted to say that we all need to be very, very careful how we speculate about this grand jury, because the problem is, as a journalist, and that's how I'm covering it as a journalist. I'm not involved into any of the organizing the vigils or anything, but is that we don't know really what the grand jury is about. There was a transcript that was basically leaked to the No Political Repression website from Matty Pfeiffer's civil contempt hearing, or actually I'm not even sure if it was I think it was a civil contempt hearing, where they did ask him about May Day, and they specifically asked him about individuals, although those names were redacted. But when you go to try to report on the story, all you can really say is that the records are sealed. It's a secret. Nobody knows. So when people say it's about anarchism or it's about Occupy or it's about May Day, well, we do know that some of the federal documents that were released said that, I believe this was by the FBI, they said that they were following people in Portland long before May Day. So we need to keep that into perspective, that since we don't really know the details, it's really difficult to speculate. And that's one of the excuses that the mainstream media uses for not reporting on it, but I don't really think that's a good excuse, because there are some facts. There are people in jail, today. So, but in terms of the Occupy movement, it just occurred to us, we were talking about this earlier today, that back in April, in Washington State, in solidarity with the folks in Wisconsin, we formed a group called Occupy Washington.
Oh, wow.
There was a 6-day sit-in inside the state capitol dome in Olympia, Washington, which ended in basically a mass arrest. But for 6 days, people were sitting in at the governor's office and trying to get into the House of Representatives and the Senate, because they were voting on some major cuts to social programs and education in Washington State. The state was in $3 billion debt, actually. I think most people don't realize that. So Governor Gregoire was presiding over a special session even through November, and the first phase was a 6-day sit-in protest, which ended when the governor ordered the state patrol to arrest everyone there. And they did this thing which they've done in other places around the country, where they tried to get people to sign these things that are they called no trespass, or actually people in Olympia call them no trespass orders, but they have many different names throughout the country. But it was a way of banning the protesters from the state capitol. So they would basically threaten people under duress. We can either take you in and charge you, or you can sign this, which will ban you from the state capitol for, a year or something. So that happened in April, and I was a part of that sit-in. But in November, it happened again because there was a special session, and at one point there were 10,000 people outside of the state capitol protesting the budget cuts, and 15 labor union members were arrested inside the governor's office trying to force a meeting with her. It was this protest only lasted for a few days, though, the sit-in, because I believe, after a 6-day sit-in, they just didn't want it to happen again. So it was late in November. It was November 28th. They had the Christmas tree up already, and people were gathered around the Christmas tree, refusing to leave after a sit-in at the governor's office. I was there as a reporter. I was calling in to several different radio networks reporting what was happening there. I was wearing a press pass, which was fully visible, and I was asked by the Washington State Patrol officer in charge to leave. I refused to leave. I noticed there were some other corporate cameramen and reporters around. They just sort of backed off and kind of hid somewhere, or stood on the balcony where the police couldn't harass them. But I refused to leave. I stood right there and actually sat down with the rest of the protesters. And the next thing I know, I was carried away by 4 Washington State Patrol officers. They took my photo and made me stand in a back room in the state capitol for a while they got these documents together and asked me to sign it. And I said I refuse to sign anything without legal consultation. So the officer just signed it himself and handed it to me, and I looked at it, and it said that I was banned from all state property in Olympia for the next 30 days, which meant that I would not be able to report on any of the protests that were ongoing. And this was following some other really confrontational situations where the Washington State Patrol had actually tasered a bunch of demonstrators to try to disperse them. So I immediately challenged it. We became the lead plaintiff in a class action federal civil rights lawsuit against the Washington State Patrol. And Federal District Judge Robert J. Bryan ruled with me, saying that it was a violation of the freedom of the press, and that any illegal detaining or banning of people from the state capitol or state property was a extrajudicial violation by the police department. In other words, no one had gone before a jury or a judge. No one had been charged with anything that the police were punishing us. So that was overturned, and we won that case, which, by the way, and this goes back to a theme that I keep going back to, which is that it was not reported anywhere in the corporate news media. It would be very, very hard to find any information about it. But because of that case, 36 other people who had subsequently challenged their banning by going back to the protest and were arrested for criminal trespass, they had all of their charges dropped, and the Washington State Patrol is no longer able to ban people or illegally detain them at a demonstration. So they had to completely change their law enforcement procedures. So we won, and that was a great victory for the First Amendment and for freedom of the press.
So
however, like I said, no one will know about it because, once again, the corporate media just decided to not report on it.
Yeah, my question to you is, how come I haven't heard about any of this stuff down in Eugene, Oregon? And I'm pretty tuned into this stuff. So how come it never got reported?
Because they arrested one of the reporters. I mean, they made it really tough to report it.
So that's the thing, is if, you can find my story, at maybe Reporters Without Borders and other websites that are investigating this issue. And, there's been plenty of communication with the ACLU and other civil rights groups about it. But I think that it was just a case of where the corporate media just decided that they didn't. I think the judge made his decision in the middle of the night. Nobody knew about it. I didn't get a call from the attorneys until late the next day. The news media just looked at it and said, well, there's a car wreck happening, or,
Yeah, right.
Whatever the reason is, there are certain stories that are not being covered, and that's why I keep saying that if there's one thing that could come out of the Occupy Wall Street movement, And if that thing is a support for the alternative media and more citizen voices, more citizen journalists and community journalists gaining a greater voice in the country to counter all of this corporate censorship, I think that would be a great achievement, and I would be very happy, to see that happen. I would love to see the occupiers around the country supporting Free Speech Radio News, Democracy Now!, what you guys are doing, the live streamers, Lukowski and Tim Pool, and everyone who's trying to do something to break through that corporate news barrier. A lot of the good information that I get comes directly from Occupy media groups tweeting. Like, we just found out that they have shut down the ports in Los Angeles right now. Most of the terminals in the Port of Los Angeles are now closed because of strike by clerical workers.
Okay, that's a headline there, Mark.
You scooped them.
Let's talk about that.
It just happened. The clerical workers have shut down most of the terminals there, and it has been finally picked up by Reuters. But originally it went out from Occupy LA and other Occupy groups. But as of right now, as of 10:27 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is a few hours ago, so not very long ago.
Talk into your phone, though, Mark, please.
I'm sorry. Most of the terminals are currently shut down by a labor action by the clerical workers. So 8 of the terminals at the Port of Los Angeles were shut down, along with 6 terminals at the Port of Long Beach. And the strike is the largest work stoppage at the ports in a decade. But nobody really knows how long they plan to do this. But it's longshore clerks. They're in dispute with the terminal operators once again, this time over staffing issues. So it's the ILWU Local 63, and they took to the picket line earlier today, and other key personnel like the crane operators, also represented by the ILWU, have refused to cross the picket lines. So the head negotiator at the port operations in Los Angeles said that the strike, quote, marks a dangerous escalation in the group's ongoing dispute with the union. A dangerous escalation in that they might be forced to address it? He added that if the strike continues, the negative effects on jobs and the economy will be felt nationwide.
That's why they're striking, because that gives them power.
As though we haven't been feeling it already.
Yeah. Well, that's
$273 billion that passed through the port last year. So it's huge. I mean, this happened once before. Remember, we just had a trial in Seattle for the port protesters here, in solidarity with the folks in Oakland and Los Angeles last year in December.
Yeah, December 12th, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
that was interesting for us because the police claimed that the demonstrators were violent, and yet the very next day, the Department of Justice announced their report on the Seattle Police Department, claiming that they use a practice and policy of excessive use of force. So sort of the issue of the port protest kind of disappeared at that moment. And we've had an ongoing situation ever since with a federal mediator and the mayor and the police chief dragging their feet on all these reforms. So, but yes, the port is closed right now, as far as we know, at least most of the terminals.
Yeah, I wish we had the breaking news musical clip there, but here it is, Occupy Radio. We have breaking news.
Yeah. So actually, locally, we have a case going on, which is probably due back into court fairly soon. We had a little outpost at the old federal building, and they refused to give us a new permit, or actually had some very restrictive terms, and we said no. And so one of our people got arrested, and we had an original hearing, and they gave the government 3 weeks to put together a better case. And the government's asked for an extension, but I suspect that it should be back into court reasonably soon. And so if this one gets upheld on basically constitutional First Amendment right of protest, half of the regulations and regarding the use of or outside groups using federal property will probably get thrown out. It's an enormous case, and yet except for the fact that it's happening here quietly in Eugene. Nobody in the world knows about it.
Yeah, the judge in that case has stated that there is a suspicious pattern of enforcement against protesters in Eugene, and that that particular judge said that is not acceptable, and that's why the government had to go back and reconfigure their case, because the judge said that's not going to work.
Yeah.
So actually, it's been difficult to get information on that case. The only thing I've heard is through Occupy Oregon folks, but I'm curious, to follow up on that, because there was a report earlier this year that I have a copy of somewhere where some media report was talking about how there was a memo that was released saying that Obama's Justice Department actually did not want that, and I'm not sure if this is the same case, but there was a particular case in Portland where folks were on federal property, and the Obama Justice Department was actually not happy with the local police in the way they dealt with that, because they did not want those arrests. So there's some confusion as to who's in control sometimes during these situations. And then also, maybe you could tell me a little bit more, if you know, about a story we've heard a couple times here, usually in the weekly press briefing at the Occupy conference call on Thursdays, but which I invite everyone to. It's on noon on Thursdays, and there's a weekly report from groups all over the country, and alternative media journalists jump on there to get breaking stories.
I wish that wouldn't happen when I'm working. Sorry for cutting you off. What they were talking
about was a pepper spraying incident there in Oregon. Do you know what I'm talking about? I believe it was college students.
Yeah, there was a pepper spraying thing at Lane. Mike's got some information. Turn your mic on and tell us.
Rain.
Oh, rain. Well, yeah. We had an event down at
Kids March.
Yeah, Kids March down, I guess it was April, at the Park Blocks in Eugene. And it's kind of interesting because the officer who provoked the incident is no longer with the force. He was quietly allowed to retire because apparently he had caused a number of these issues. But they provoked a couple of women, and then the police backed off, and then as they left the site, the police sort of ganged up and arrested them. And
violently,
quite violently, broke a
wrist,
wrist and a rib, and basically body slammed these people. Threatened to tase them, and
there was pepper spray, but the target was able to pull her hood down before she could get it. I don't know if this is the story you're talking about, Mark. That's the one that we have locally.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. I'll check tomorrow on that call and see if it's the same story. I'm just curious. That part of the reason I think we need some kind of regional or national Occupy media so that we can find out about these things, because except for that weekly press briefing or people tweeting about things, it's pretty hard to get this information most of the time.
There was an internal investigation with the police. I think there's a court case coming up, although its date, it hasn't been heard yet. But the internal investigation by the police sort of whitewashed it, and then they went in front of the Civilian Review Board, which also agreed with the police assessment. And there's been several cases that I've kind of looked at with the Civilian Review Board, and I'm deeply troubled by their process. Basically, the police get to write up what they want, sanitize the entire report of any of the real facts, and then don't give the people involved any opportunity to rebut their version of it. So we have a pretty badly flawed Civilian Review Board process here. But I guess we're getting close to the end of our time.
Yes, we are.
Making the check. Is he here yet?
I do not see Pablo. I don't know if that means he's not here. But hey, Mark, you said that you think we need a national Occupy media, and I agree. We began that process this last Sunday on a conference call about creating a national Occupy cable show. They're thinking they're going to aim it at I guess Link, and I don't know all the different cable networks, but they're trying to build that out of Occupy Public Access TV in Brooklyn. So I will send you links to that when I send you a link to this podcast. And so we're going to have to wrap this up. You got anything you want to say before we say goodbye?
Just people can check out my reports at Pacifica Radio and Free Speech Radio News, and I have a YouTube channel too, MTC TV Media. But I wanted to let people know about the U.S. Media Working Group too, and the international collaboration that's going on. So if you go to interoccupy.net, you'll see that once a week, actually 3 times a week at this point, there are meetings going on nationally and internationally to try to bring together some kind of alternative Occupy Indignatos, whatever, kitchen revolution kind of media, so that we can all talk to each other nationally and internationally and kind of bypass a lot of this corporate nonsense. So if anybody wants to get involved with that, go to interoccupy.net and check it out. We welcome everybody to jump in and help us do this. And the cable program sounds great. Anything we can do to support alternative media and create a network and some kind of alternative news wire would be amazing right now. So I'm committed. So I hope other people will be too. And thanks for your good work. I appreciate what you guys are doing, and keep it up.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
Okay.
We'll
Bye-bye.
talk again soon. Bye.
Okay. Good night.
All right. And I want to do my regular plug. Please do go to Occupy Media on iTunes. While you are there downloading our latest show with Mark Taylor-Canfield and Chris Hermes on the grand jury process here in the Northwest, please also get down to the bottom, give us 5 stars, say wonderful things about Joe's voice, my personality, and Mike's handling of our cat-like behavior. Oh, did you want to say
shenanigans?
Shenanigans, yes. And so you can also go to occupymediapodcast.com, and you can get downloads there. Please do note that we are about to add a new show to our podcast with Air Occupy, and with December 11th, Air Occupy will have an interview with Noam Chomsky. That will be on the podcast as well. And if you want to be part of our focus group, please get in touch with us through Facebook at our Occupy Media Podcast or Occupy Eugene Media Group, and we will wrap you up into our focus group, and you can tell us what we should be doing to make you want to listen more. And that's all the chattering I'm going to do. Mike, you got a song for us? And we got Pablo waiting to go. Give me the old raised eyebrows. He's ready and raring. And
I do. Joe, you got anything last words to say tonight?
See you guys next week.
KWVA 88.1 FM. See you next week as well.